Our first speaker is Andreas Kokkvoll Tveit from the Institute for Transport Economics in Norway, and he's going to tell us about what's driving CO2 emissions from passenger transport in Norway. So I'll hand over to you for 15 minutes, Andreas.
Lovely. Thank you, Kate. Okay. Hopefully the motivation for hopefully the motivation for this for my assessment should be quite clear. As we all know, passenger transport is a major source of CO2 emissions. In Norway, in 2018, 13.6% of Norway's total CO2 emissions came from passenger transport. And comparatively, internationally, that's not a very high share. So this is a very important source of CO2 emissions globally too. So this assessment or this study, this paper asks what affects the CO2 emissions of passenger transport. So, for instance, are such emissions mainly driven by, let's call them structural factors such as population growth, or are they sensitive to other factors such as technological developments? So it's important to note that the present study does not test the effects of individual specific policies, but more of, let's call them larger aggregated drivers. So I collect annual data covering the period from 2010 to 2018. And these data are collected on population, passenger kilometers, short PKM, vehicle kilometers, VKM, CO2 emissions, and energy consumption for a number of transport modes. And these transport modes include active transport, such as walking and biking, railways, trams, metro, passenger cars, and here, importantly, the data are segregated on a number of subcategories of passenger cars. Likewise for buses, and finally aviation. So as you can see, I have not included data on sea transport. That's mainly due to data limitations. I'll say a few words on the methods. What is usually referred to decomposition analysis is mainly it's a group of assessment techniques that were introduced in the 1970s to assess drivers of energy consumption. It has since been applied to a variety of areas, including CO2 emissions. However, only a handful of academic studies have decomposed the CO2 emissions from passenger transport. So based on what is called the Kaya identity, which is quite well known for energy economists, I understand CO2 emissions from passenger transport as the function of 6 components. So firstly, we got the total CO2 emissions from passenger transport in the area I study, which is Norway. First component here is population, and the motive for including that in the model should be quite clear that when the population changes, it will likely affect the CO2 emissions from passenger transport. The second component here is I refer to this as the volume factor, or it's mainly a measure of the general mobility of the population in Norway. So here we take all the passenger kilometers traveled, divided by population. So we get a measure of how far the average Norwegian travels per year. So the next component or variable here is what I refer to as market shares. It's perhaps not as straightforward to explain, but here each transport mode gets a score in accordance to its share of the total passenger transport market in Norway. So let's say that diesel cars performed 32% of all passenger kilometers in a given year. It will score 0.32 on the market share component. And as you can understand, all the sum of all the transport modes scores is 1 here. So the next component is, let's call it an occupancy component. It grasps the how well we utilize the capacity of the vehicles that are being used for passenger transport. The fifth component here is an energy intensity component. So here, each transport mode scores in accordance with the energy consumed per vehicle kilometers traveled. And finally, I got a carbon intensity factor or component, which is, so here each transport mode scores in accordance with the CO2 emitted per energy unit consumed. So, as I said, I collect annual data to assess the effects of changes from one year to another. And again, as I said, the decomposition techniques are mainly, it's a toolbox of multiple techniques, and following one of the standard references in the literature, ANG 2015, I use one specific model from that decomposition toolbox that presumably fits the purpose well. When I prepared my presentation, I was thinking about how much math I should include in the methods section, but given that this is a intermediary session, and I don't only have 15 minutes, I just decided against saying much more on the methods. But very crudely speaking, you can say that the effect of one component is estimated by letting that component change, while all other components are held constant from one year to another. So my data set is quite rich, so I have run quite a lot of analysis. I will only show you the two most important. Table 1 here shows the results of decompositions of passenger transport emissions change from 2010 to 2018. And we can recognize all the components from the equation or the identity that I showed you previously. And the interpretation of the results here is quite straightforward. When it says 8.4% for population, means that the isolated effect of the population change from 2010 to 2018 on emissions was 8.4%, meaning in emissions increasing effect. An important assumption here is that in this analysis, biofuels are assumed carbon neutral. And as I will show you in the next result table, that's a quite consequential assumption. You can see for the, well, I think even more interesting result is for the volume factor. To repeat, it's a measure of the general population, the general mobility of the population. And in contrast with population, this general mobility is indeed targeted by policies to reduce some of the travel demand. For instance, in urban areas in Norway, most have what we call zero growth targets, meaning that all growth in passenger transport should be done by active transport or public transport. And as you can see, the isolated effect of volume on emissions is 11.1 which is a strong emissions increasing effect. And that tells us that even though some policies to reduce transport demand might be effective, the forces that drive that transport demand up are far stronger than the forces that are reducing transport demand. The remaining components or factors have emissions reducing effects. The estimate for market shares of minus 9.1% says that that's the isolated effect of market shares changes are minus 9.1%, which basically means that the transport modes with relatively low emissions have indeed replaced transport mode with higher emissions. The occupancy factor has a slight emissions reducing effect. So has the energy intensity factor, minus 3.3%, while carbon intensity is estimated at minus 7.1%, which is a quite strong emissions reducing effect. And we will see in the next result table that that estimate is quite sensitive to assumptions. And as we can see, the total emissions from passenger transport go down by 5.2% from 2010 to 2018, which is seemingly all good. So let's go to the next table. Here, everything is equal except for that I changed the assumption regarding biofuels. Here I include the emissions from the end users of biofuels. And as you can see, both the total emissions change and some of the factors results are quite sensitive to that assumption. Now, when we include the emissions from biofuels, the total emissions from passenger transport go up to 2018 from 2010. And now the change is plus 2.6%, and the carbon intensity factor is now at minus 0.6%, which is close to zero. And as we remember, in the previous table, that was minus 7.1%. So this means that the assumption regarding biofuels is very important for both the total emissions and the results of my analysis. But you can see that many of the other factors are stable. So it's mainly the carbon intensity estimate that is changed. So to sum up, population and volume, which is the mobility per capita, have strong emissions decreasing effects. And low emissions transport modes have taken market shares from relatively emissions intensive transport. Reduced carbon intensity seems to have cut emissions, but that is only assuming that biofuels are carbon neutral. And when I include the biofuels emissions, I find that the total emissions increase by 2.6% between 2010 and 2018. So that is pretty much what I plan to say, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andreas, and thank you for keeping to time so well. Do we have a couple of a few minutes for points of clarification or brief questions on that? If anyone wants to add something to the chat or raise a hand, which you can do through the reactions button on your screen. I've got a raised hand from Greg Marsden. So do you want to come off mute and ask a question, Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. Really enjoyed that presentation, very clearly communicated. So a lot of people will perhaps be surprised by those results, given the shift to electric in Norway. What you know, how important has that been in terms of the data that you've got up to 2018, for example?
I think it's my analysis show that they are quite important, and the shift towards battery cars is you can see it from the estimate for the market shares in both tables, I think, because that result I can even go back. Yeah, in table 1, estimated at minus 9.1%. That is mainly driven by the phasing in of electric vehicles, which has been quite remarkable over the period studied. But as you can see, again, it's assuming that biofuels are not carbon neutral, the phasing in of electric vehicles cannot prevent total emissions from passenger transport going up, which I think is interesting.
Very sobering. Thanks, Andreas.
I've got a question for Amelia Sumalainen, and that's it's relevant, and we've still got time to take it. So Amelia, do you want to come off mic and ask that question?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I can ask that. Thank you. I was just wondering, based on these very interesting results that you showed us here, what would be your policy recommendations for transport decarbonisation? So I imagine that based on these results, for instance, you would not recommend biofuel use or things like that. Thank you.
I'm certainly not a biofuels emissions expert, so my solution here is that basically to run my results using the both extremes of assumptions. But let's just assume that the total emissions effect of biofuels is not clear. I would rather go for continuing incentivizing electrification, which might, of course, have some externalities somewhere, but seems like a safer way forward. But that's hard to give a lot of recommendations based on these results. But I think it's noteworthy for everyone that any politician to know that the effects of that all the results are so sensitive to the assumption regarding biofuels.
Fantastic. So if you have longer questions, burning questions, then please do keep those for the discussion session at the end. But thank you very much to Andreas for that. That's fascinating. I have lots of questions about demand reduction that I'd like to pick up later. So that would be great. Okay, so Andreas, if you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great. We'll have our next speaker, which is me. Thank you very much. So I'm speaking less about what tools, developing tools, more on how tools are applied in decision-making processes, and specifically focusing on how we manage uncertainty and the effects that might have on rapid decarbonisation of transport. Brilliant. So yeah, my argument is that transport decarbonisation is fraught with uncertainty, and if we ignore this uncertainty, then it'll actually slow down decarbonisation. So we have to engage with it. Decision making itself, even within that uncertainty, is complicated and fragmented by scale, issue, and mode, which affects how we can then deal with the uncertainty. There is quite a lot of guidance about this, but that itself is quite fragmented by the stage of decisions and the type of uncertainty addressed, which adds to the complexity. And that none of it really addresses the reality of how decisions are made. And it's important to become more systemic about uncertainty and to make better, more robust and ambitious decisions. And to do this, we need to fully engage with uncertainty. So just to start with what I mean by uncertainty, it's generally categorized in three different ways, often called different things, but I'm going to use these three terms. And risk, which is where we know a lot about the factors of risk and the likelihoods, so we can quantify both of these and identify them very easily. Endemic uncertainty is when we can reasonably assume the factors that are causing something to happen, and the relationships between them, but there might be challenges in representing those relationships and quantifying them. So we might have to cut off things in models, or we might have errors associated with the data that we use. But we can, if as long as we recognise those boundaries we set, we can manage that certainty quantitatively. And the third type is deep uncertainty. When it's difficult to even agree on the factors that are driving long-term change and relationships between them, and also putting any sort of probability distribution on those issues. So this deep uncertainty is quite a lot more difficult to deal with. And all of those different types of uncertainty require very different tools. So if you go to the deep uncertainty with tools that are designed for managing risk, you know, it's not just ignoring uncertainty, the problem is dealing with it inappropriately can be a problem too. So in relation to transport, there's been a lot of discussion about sources of uncertainty associated with future travel demand. And these are the multitude of uncertainties that are well documented. And I'd argue that quite a lot of those are deep uncertainties. We don't necessarily know the relationship between factors are driving, and we couldn't necessarily put probabilities on things around, for example, the changes in practices associated with changing daily routines. Another source of uncertainty is about how effective intervention into a system are. So not only projecting how a system might change, but if we actually intervene into that system, how effective might that be? What kind of impact might that have? Both in terms of the effectiveness of individual interventions, but also in the sort of cumulative effect or the network effects of multiple interventions. There's lots of extra layers of uncertainty. So I'm arguing that we need to deal with both of these kinds of uncertainties, and that's particularly important when thinking about decision making. So why should we bother about uncertainty? Well, if we ignore uncertainty, then we could potentially be locked into unsustainable paths. So if we assume a single forecast increase in car use, invest in road projects, we could then increase road use because of investing in those road projects. So we could lock ourselves into unsustainable paths. If we delay making decisions because we can't make certain some elements, which I'm not sure we'll ever make certain, then we miss windows of opportunity for change. So both of those issues will actually slow decarbonisation, which is a significant problem given how fast we need to move. Another challenge with transport, particularly place-based transport governance, is that it's very complicated. It's very fragmented across scale, across issue, across mode. So quite often nobody really owns uncertainty, and particularly the systemic networked uncertainty that propagates across different issues. And even if people are dealing with uncertainty in different areas, they might be dealing with it differently or making different assumptions, which is problematic. So the support there is some support there. There is several government documents across different government departments that could be relevant to some elements of decision making in the transport sector. We've got an uncertainty toolkit for analysis. We've got a futures toolkit by Government Office of Science, and we've got Department of Transport's own uncertainty toolkit for TAG. But how does this work with the kind of decision-making problems and uncertainty problems we've analysed associated with transport? Well, first of all, it sort of implies that each decision is isolated and follows a reasonably separate process of doing some analysis, feeding into a policy process which comes up with options, which are then appraised in a slightly separate process. And each toolkit maps onto slightly different parts of that process. So the government actual department uncertainty toolkit for analysts, perhaps unsurprisingly, is very much focused on the analysis that happens, which it seems to conceive as a separate to the policy decision-making process, and is very focused on quantitative work and on measuring and communicating uncertainty, not necessarily what you do with that uncertainty. The second toolkit is much more qualitative, deals much more with scenario planning, but doesn't really categorise uncertainty in any way. It just deals ambiguously with uncertainty. The third toolkit, much more focused at appraisal, again, mostly quantitative. It does make an attempt to categorise uncertainty, but then the methods proposed aren't necessarily linked to that categorisation. So there are questions about the coherence of the guidance that's available. I argue it doesn't necessarily reflect realities of decision making in all agencies. It is designed for national government, but a lot of decision making happens outside national government, and I'll come on to talk about that in more detail. The guidance is very separate. There's no cross-referencing between it, and there's no links between the separate parts of the process. It doesn't say how to feed work on analysis into policy processes and then out into appraisal, or how to follow through. And there isn't a consistent categorization of uncertainty, and there's no link between the uncertainty decision-making stage and method, which means that we could be using methods which are inappropriate for the problem at hand. So there's a distinct lack of coherence. What I'm going to turn to now is a case where I've been working with Transport for Greater Manchester to look at the realities of trying to manage uncertainty, and reflecting on whether the tools currently available are appropriate for the kind of problems of dealing with uncertainty in reality. So Transport for Greater Manchester have been trying to use uncertainty management methods to support decision making in their post-COVID planning, which is, I mean, the uncertainties associated with that have just propagated from a normal transport planning process. So there are significant uncertainties around both short and long-term impacts of pandemic restrictions on travel patterns. But what they have done is they've brought into place common assumptions that work across the portfolio of areas that they cover. They've got common scenarios which have shared assumptions, and they've developed common processes across different decision-making areas. And they've applied the process to many types of use. And that gives us some real insight into what perhaps a more coherent approach could look like. So one of the first key reflections from that piece of work is the reality of decision making. No decision is isolated, and actually it falls into sort of broad types of decisions. So what might the strategy for transport going forward be? Moving into the specific details of a sub-strategy of what needs to happen in a particular area or a particular transport mode, which leads into studies which then identify options to address that particular transport mode or area, which then go into plans of a series of activities that need to happen, which are then delivered through appraisal. So we can see that those decisions are not isolated. There's links between the stages, and assumptions made at one stage would feed into another. Also, the greater opportunities, the more options are much earlier in the process of decision making at the strategic sub-strategy studies level. Another challenge is that we're never starting from scratch. There's always some options on the table with legacy of decision-making processes associated with them, and we need to think about that when we're thinking about moving those options through this process. So there's a very different reality about how decision-making happens, and the need for connection between those stages, and to think about the reality of what happens in each of those stages. And none of the toolkits map across the whole process of decision-making within this example. And the other thing is the problems are very different at those decision-making stages. So at the strategic level, you might be thinking very broadly about how travel as a whole needs to change to achieve objectives. But at the sub-strategy, you might be thinking, well, how in, for example, rapid transport, how would that need to change to allow that system-wide change in travel to happen? At the study level, it might be more specifically what options might achieve the objectives you've set out for that particular area or issue. And then when going down to the delivery, you've already chosen your options. How might you make that more future-proof or more resilient to changes in the future? They're very different problems which require very different methods or dealing with different types of uncertainties at different stages. The different uncertainties and the different kind of stages and issues require very different methods. So across the suite of, they had a standard suite of scenarios at Transport for Greater Manchester, but they used them very differently. So at the strategic level, it was much more about backcasting of this is the future that we want. How do we achieve that across these very different range of scenarios? Or which scenarios are not going to allow us to achieve this? What might we need to do to avoid that scenario? Whereas at the sort of studies delivery end, it's much more about stress testing. We have a lot of options. How do we make them more robust to the range of scenarios that might occur? So using the same resources, but in very different ways, so very different methods were used in these cases. So what we're arguing for is a more systematic approach when dealing with uncertainty that takes into account the realities of decision making, but also the very different kinds of uncertainties and problems we're dealing with in the decision making. So the first thing we're arguing for is that more effort is made at the strategic end, where the decision space and the option space is much more open, and we have more possibility for accommodating uncertainty and not just trying to quantify and deal with uncertainty. And the second argument is that we need to match the uncertainty analysis approach much more carefully to the stage of decision making we're at, the kind of problem we're dealing with, and also the type of uncertainty. So there needs to be a much clearer mapping across between that. And the third thing is that we need to get better at linking stages of decision making. So if we've been done some analysis at the sub-strategy level that is looking at uncertainty associated with achieving specific objectives, how do we take that analysis through when we're appraising options and not assume that those are completely separate things? So just to conclude there, ignoring uncertainty or avoiding decisions will slow decarbonisation, so we absolutely can't do that anymore. Lots of methods for dealing with uncertainty exist, but there's not a great deal of clarity about when to use them, how to use them, and in which particular circumstance they're most appropriate. The Department for Transport is trying to take a very pragmatic approach of when the problem is bigger, invest more analysis in it. So take a very proportionate approach, and we absolutely agree that that's the more important way forward. But we argue that we need a more coherent and consistent approach, which really focuses on where decision options are most open, reflecting the decision-making process and reflecting the type of uncertainty more appropriately, and crucially linking between stages of decision-making so that assumptions and options are fed forwards. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Katy. So we've got 5 minutes again for questions of clarification or initial questions on Katy's presentation. I can't see any in the chat box at the moment, but sometimes people are busy typing immediately as the presentation comes to an end. So I'll ask my one, Katy. How do they how are they using this to respond to things like the inevitability of government just making announcements about a new funding stream that's available? How does it connect the uncertainty analysis to the kind of short-termism that we know exists?
That's a crucial point that I didn't mention in the decision-making space, is how extensively decisions are affected by what funding is available for them. So one of the things is by having this systematic approach, the idea is that there are more projects in the pipeline which we know need to happen, and when funding becomes available, they're ready to be deployed, but we know the implications, and we know we can take them off the shelf because we have this virtual shelf. We take it off the shelf knowing the uncertainty that comes along. So quite often there's a big lag between when things are just, decided to be necessary and when funding becomes available. And external circumstances could change significantly in that period of time. The idea is that by having a more systematic approach to uncertainty, that when you move from deciding something is necessary to be actually able to deploy it, you can go back and check key assumptions and do that. And I'd say that matters a lot at the strategic level as well, because funding is one of the key uncertainties. So that is an uncertainty that would have to be taken into account at the strategic level as well, is to, what is the likelihood of funding environment changing or government decision making changing, and how would that affect plans and strategies we have? So there's two different levels. Is what do we do when we take things off the shelf and have to deploy things to account for the uncertainties that might have changed while they've been on the shelf, and the other is to account for that specifically as an uncertainty at the strategic level, to make sure plans are more robust to changes in government funding and strategies.
Great, thanks. So we've got 2 questions in the chat, and Aimee, you had your hand up a moment ago. It's gone down again. Do you want to come off mic and ask a question?
Okay, so actually I saw some questions, so I just think that's a limited time, so I just think that I should save it for the discussion. But anyway, if you give me a chance, I will ask the questions. So actually, I'm really interested in your presentation, Katy. It's really matching with what I'm doing on like uncertainty. But actually, when I do, it's not like about uncertainty, but it's about logging. So I just have questions like we have a lot of tools to identify the uncertainty, but do you like happen to find out any like kind of framework that it will display, it will kind of guideline to the policymakers or even like the expert to identify exactly what is the components or factors in the urban areas or in the city to identify the uncertainty, at least tools or the instrument?
I think there are lots of tools to help with analysis and quantification. I think what we're really looking at is how do you target them to the problem you have. What we're really calling for is helping people to identify the uncertainty problem they have and find the tools to help them with that. I don't think the factors of uncertainty will be the same in any place. I don't think we'd ever get to a point where we could say, these will be your uncertain factors. I think we're trying to get to better processes to help people identify the uncertain factors they're dealing with, and then the tools that most available to help deal with those.
Okay, thank you.
Follow up afterwards if that's not clear.
Yeah. So I will have more questions in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hai. I think we'll save Andreas's question to the longer discussion at the end, because I think that's probably join up in some of the other presentations. So just perhaps a quick one, Katy, a quick last one. Tim Haugego has asked, are you ultimately trying to make uncertainties seem certain, which is a common political presumption, or manage them as inherently uncertain, which is perhaps more real?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I'm absolutely not saying we can make uncertainty seem certain, and that's particularly the case with deep uncertainties when we're never going to be able to quantify them, and we're going to have to accept that we aren't going to be able to make them certain ever or enough now. So that the reality is how do we signpost people to tools that allow them to manage them, to make them decisions more robust to possible uncertainties or adaptable as those things play out in the future. And I think that's what we're less good at. There's less guidance on how to actually act under uncertainty. There's a lot of guidance on how to quantify, manage, quantify and communicate uncertainty, which it does make it seem a little more certain. The kind of tools that we're working with TFGM and in other places is definitely about how to manage them and work under deep uncertainty. So thanks for clarifying that.
Great. Well, I think that's the 20 minutes up, Katy, so I'm happy to hand back to you now to carry on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to switch back into chairing now to hand over to Adam Goodchild from Transport for the North. So Adam,
hello.
If you share your slides, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Bear with me. There we are. Does that come through for everyone?
That's great. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Ace, right, I will take it away then. So I'm Adam Goodchild. For anyone who doesn't know, which I imagine it's everyone, I'm the decarbonisation technical lead at Transport for the North. So this presentation's on regional transport carbon modelling. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to look at the sort of analysis framework that we use at Transport for the North for our decarbonisation process. If you've seen my colleagues Peter Cole's presentation earlier in the week, I apologise because there's going to be a little bit of overlap at the start for people who haven't seen both. But without further ado, I will jump in. Okay, so Transport for the North is a subnational transport body. It was the first one to be made statutory back in 2018. We encompass 20 local transport authorities, I think 11 local transport enterprises. We've got overlap with Highways England, High Speed 2 Limited and Network Rail, and we work closely with the Department of Transport. You can think of us as sort of regional interface between the local and national level, but we're very much not about devolving power from the top or detracting from our local authorities. What we really aim to do is hear what the North of England needs from its transport, unify the voices of all of those stakeholders, and then work to our best ability to achieve those. So why regional? A lot of emissions are cross-boundary, so whether that be freight, commuting, business, holidays, etc. It's very hard for a local authority to manage all of those emissions when they only see part of the total coherent picture. So regional has a lot of advantages there. There's obviously enabling more coordination between local authorities. We've got wider cooperation between other regions of England when we operate on the regional level, and we can engage in a more objective analysis of resources, see where we might need interventions in our regional strategy. If you look at those images in the bottom right there, we can see CO2 emissions per head on one side and then emissions intensity on the other. And clearly those are telling two different versions of the same story. Those differences might be based on whether a region is rural, urban, suburban. It might be reflective of the demographics, what kind of policy or advancements being made in that region. And these can obviously govern and change what kind of policy interventions or strategies we might use on a regional level. Okay, so over the next couple of slides, we're going to go over our sort of analysis framework, starting with greenhouse gas inventory here in this quite high level diagram. We take our existing emissions and then we combine those with 4 distinct possible futures, which are the TFN future travel scenarios. This gets us 4 different projections. We compare our projections to a trajectory, and this gets us our 4 different pathways. Then we use policy analysis to basically see what can bring these different pathways back in line with our target trajectory. And this forms the evidence base of our decarbonisation strategy. Right, so visualizing that a little bit here, you can see we have our 4 different trajectories of our different travel scenarios, just about managing prioritized places, digitally distributed, and urban zero carbon. I won't go into too much detail about what they consist of. I think from the names, you can probably get a good feel for what they might entail. I think one thing we do want to stress though is these trajectories do not represent goals. They represent possible futures. Our goal is always the target trajectory, which is underneath all those in the graph there. What's interesting to consider is the kind of policy gap or emissions gap which we need to close and how exactly we can achieve that. You can see on our trajectory there, we get to very near zero in 2045 and complete zero at 2050. I'll stress that's very much real zero. We're not considering negative emissions or carbon capture technology there, because I think when it comes to the transport sector, we don't need to do that at all. And there might be other sectors that might want that benefit. Our trajectory is actually more ambitious than national governments. This is based from working with our local stakeholders, the local authorities, etc., and seeing what their own ambitions are and what they'd really like to push for. So that's a direct product of that. Right, so those emissions you saw on the previous slide, obviously coming from somewhere. We calculate our emissions for our trajectories using a combination of demand and emissions intensity. Demand essentially represents vehicle kilometer demand. This comes from data from our Northern Economic Land Use Model, primarily, NELAM for short. This includes data like employment, population, household data, socioeconomic factors, the actual transport system and factors within that. And then emissions intensity comes from composition of vehicle fleet and transport system factors as well. So vehicle fleet obviously plays a huge role in deciding what our emissions are, what proportion are still using cars over public transport, what the fuel composition are within these, whether heavy goods vehicles are electric yet, whether they're still diesel, so on and so forth. And this all comes from our no-carb model, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And obviously we get 4 different emissions trajectories from our 4 different future travel scenarios. Right, so the Northern Carbon Tool, or no-carb for short, is really just a highway fleet model with functionality which allows us to calculate emissions combined into that. So we take base fleet data and new sales by scenarios and scrappage curves, and we combine all those to basically get projections of what we think the future fleet will look like. Base fleet and scrappage curves are coming from historic data, our new sales and scenarios coming from our future travel scenarios. These are obviously all based upon various different assumptions, what we think policy might look like, which varies across the different scenarios. We combine these with speed emission curves and then our demand speed curves. So these are stuff about total vehicle kilometers traveled, how speed is being distributed, because different speeds obviously produce different levels of emissions. And this combines to give us calculations for road CO2. This is then merged with simplified bus and rail, and this gives us our final reporting CO2 and demand trajectories. One thing to stress about no carb is our zonal inputs very soft coded. So obviously we do this for the north of England, but this can be taken and done for any region effectively. All you need to do that is a highway model. We use Saturn, but we've also developed a tool which allows Saturn highway models to interface, and we can convert those data coming out of that to useful forms to use in no carb. So that's all been taken care of. So here we can see some aggregated data that comes out of no carb. This is from, I think, the urban zero carbon scenario. If you're looking at the graphs here, the keys for each column are located at the bottom of the slide. So you can see we can get all kinds of data on CO2 emissions by mode. We can get vehicle kilometer data. We can see projections for future fleet by fuel type, vehicle type. We've got car, van, and HGVs displayed here. We can do this on a zonal level, so we can break down for any different zone that we choose to use. On the right-hand side, top here, we're using our NELAM zones, but we could do this for MSOA or other types of model zone as well. And then we can also produce other kinds of data as well. Here we can see we've got displayed in the bottom right, urban, suburban, and rural data. So one of the things that we aim to do with this is incorporate it into our transport planning process, which we're currently in the starting phase of doing. So say you have a highway model reference case, and then you have a scheme which will be represented in a highway model. What we do is we put those into no carb, and then we can get CO2 impacts which come out of these various different highway schemes. We can compare this to the decarbonisation trajectory and see what kind of policy might be needed to compensate for the introduction of a new scheme. This all feeds back into our business case, and obviously if the impacts might be too severe, then we can give recommendations to delay or halt a particular highway scheme. Something else we're developing is the electric vehicle charging infrastructure tool. So this aims to basically create a sort of distribution based on future projections of electric vehicle demand of where we might want to place different electric vehicle charging points. So from this, we obviously hope to be able to assist local authorities in working out exactly how many charging points they might need, where to be located, whether they need to be fast, rapid, whether they can be slow. We even hope to be able to produce more nuanced data with this. So perhaps best locations to be placed on the major road networks, information of that nature. So we're very much about sort of maximizing the investment value for these tools. So everything at Transport for the North is developed wherever possible to be open source with publicly owned IP. This really allows anyone to basically come in and take advantage of our tools. We share these with local authorities, other subnational transport bodies, and all of this is done with the aim of basically building a common analytical framework. So it's obviously going to maximize taxpayer benefit in terms of money or value for money, and it also helps make the assessment scheme at the national level more efficient, because information we submit for review there, if it's all using a common analytical framework, then that's obviously going to make that process more efficient as well. One thing we want to stress is this is obviously going to be very collaborative in nature. So if we're sharing this, we very much expect people to go away and make their own developments, improvements based on their own regions or just general improvements. And then we're going to end up with these different diverging and then remerging branches of the tool, which is mutually beneficial for everyone involved. So the next steps for TFN are, well, we've just gone through our decarbonisation strategy consultation process. So we've just gone through the process of opening the app to consultation with the public, getting feedback there, and we're in the process of updating our strategy and making changes to the model. We're perpetually making improvements and updates to no carb. These can be including things like biofuels. We are overhauling how public transport is going to be represented in no carb as well at the moment. Another things we're doing is using it as support tools for other projects. So developments of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure tool we've touched upon there, representation in highway schemes, and then we have carbon impacts of the TFN investment program as well. We're also looking to incorporate aviation and shipping at the moment, but that's a little bit uncertain. Aviation and shipping are obviously very significant components within the overall picture, especially as they're one of the hardest transport sectors to get to reach zero as well. So we're very much interested in incorporating those in our strategy process, essentially. Right, so that concludes the end of my talk. I was a little bit worried about going over at the start. It looks like I've cut too much, but hopefully that brings us back on time. And obviously people are free to bombard me with questions now or any clarifications might be needed. Right.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive and also gives us a couple of extra time for questions now. So if anyone has any questions, points of clarification, I've got a couple of questions in the chat from Eric Thomason and Greg Marsden. So do you want to come off mic and ask those questions, Eric? No, maybe he's not feeling keen on that. But Eric asked, have you looked to classify smaller areas and therefore group areas with similar issues and encourage them to work together to develop policies or solutions?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't move fast enough.
Oh, sorry, Eric. I got you to phrase your question in a different way to that, then please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, I think as you just summarised, I was just wondering as you were presenting the spatial pictures, whether or not you could actually, if you were doing work, particularly at smaller area levels or MSOA level or groupings of MSOAs, whether you've looked at classifying and identifying areas where they appear to have similar problems and they might be able to work together across, across the whole of the transport for the North area.
Mm-hmm. So as it stands, our model mainly uses what we call our NELM zones, which are much larger zones. I think there's about 700 in the north. We're currently switching these to NOHAM zones, which are basically very, very similar to MSOA. We have various keys in place to translate between those twos. Obviously, there's a couple of thousand of those. So that functionality is definitely coming out right now. There's certainly a lot of similarity between certain MSA groups. You can engage in some level of classification. Obviously, there's always a danger to categorization because two regions that might look similar, even when they have, say, similar demographics to rural populations, there's definitely some common methodologies you can apply there. And obviously, when you're coordinating regional transport strategy, these are very useful. But of course, there's individual distinctions as well. But yes, this is obviously something that we're very much interested in doing and engaging with local authorities in order to help coordinate that. Hopefully, these are all things that drop out of our decarbonisation strategy.
Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. And Greg, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Just wondering, some of your bigger urban areas have their own carbon models. Just wondering whether you've done any consistency analysis with them, what you think the particular advantages of your tools are over what they have, for example, your understanding of freight, and do they use your model results? And if so, how?
Okay, so there's, where do I want to start with this? So to some level, I think no carb's only really just starting to get off the ground. So a lot of our data is very useful at regional level. One thing that I really want to work on improving right now is enhancing the sort of advantages this has to local authorities. Obviously, where there's already existing overlap, we want to make considerations. We don't really want to do the same work twice. But this is hopefully going to be very useful, particularly for local authorities that haven't develop their own carbonisation or decarbonisation sort of tools of this nature. I imagine local authority decarbonisation models or highway fleet models, whatever we wish to call them here, probably focus purely within their own sort of local authorities. So to what extent they're looking at interaction on a much broader scale, to what extent and how complex their modelling is for various different transport activities that are basically going in or out of their own sort of jurisdictions. I can't say, but I would probably guess that our models probably engage in a bit more sort of complex analysis there, but when probably making more simplifications compared to assessments within their own regions. So I think really what the tools provided probably differs in that extent, and they have slightly different uses. We've obviously got a bit more of a regional coordination aspect in the wider picture component there, and they might be focusing on a much more granular level within their own regions, which is something that we can't really afford to do in a model like this, because the runtime would obviously go through the roof to have such complex mapping, granular scale. I think there was quite a few parts to your questions there, so I'm not sure if I hit everything. You want to have any follow-ups, by all means.
No, I think that's really helpful. I think I made the point earlier in the week that there's no one right scale to look at this. So I think it's important that we've got tools that operate at different scales, but interesting to see how the dialogue between the tools at different scales and the users of those and the policy implications evolve over time. And as you say, it's quite new, but very pioneering work. So appreciate you sharing that with us.
Right.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Anyone want to sneak in quickly? Okay, I'm just going to ask a quick question myself then. It was great to see that the number of scenarios is used when doing your decarbonisation pathways and to identify the policy gap. When you're doing the appraisal later and you're comparing sort of with scheme and without scheme, are you using similar scenarios then to look at the impact of the scheme across the range of those scenarios?
So our future travel scenarios are pretty much consistent across all of TFN work, even components which aren't directly related to decarbonisation. This is obviously incredibly useful because it means we can just immediately steal data from other parts of TFN and directly insert them and do analysis on them. So yes, these are still using the future travel scenarios. So we have essentially 4 different versions of those, which will all factor into our assessment of a particular highway scheme.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for sticking to time. We are on time. And I'm going to hand over now. So thank you very much, Adam. If you could stop sharing your screen, I'll ask Tom Gold and Simon Pope from WSP to present their more regional carbon calculations.
Great, thanks, Katie. Hopefully you should be able to see my screen.
Yep, I can see it. It's in presenter.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Your microphone's a little muted, so I think it might be up.
Start. Okay. There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much. My name's Simon Pope, and I work for WSP.
My name's Tom Gold. I'm an associate consultant at WSP.
Great. So I thought we'd start by just explaining a little bit about who we are. So I'm proud to say I work for WSP, and the primary reason for that is because of the role that it gives me in helping solve what I would argue is the greatest challenge we face as a society. What do we do? Well, we are the largest supplier of support to professional services to local government in the UK. We also work for organisations like the sub-regional national transport bodies, Highways England, Department for Transport. We're an international company, but just to give you an idea of scale, in the north of England alone, we employ over 1,000 staff across a whole range of different disciplines. And it's no exaggeration to say that the climate emergency is revolutionising our industry across all of those disciplines at the moment. Yes, it's a very daunting challenge, but it's also very exciting to be at the forefront of something so important. And so as an advisory organisation, we're having to reflect on how to evolve our offer to help all forms of government meet that challenge. Fundamentally, we're starting to see a cultural change in how we develop infrastructure projects right across the full project life cycle. So from the earlier strategy phases, through the feasibility and the selection of solutions, through design, delivery, operation, and ultimately monitoring and evaluation. One of the key investments we've made recently is in our carbon zero appraisal framework, which is what we're going to talk to you about now. So I've stolen this graph from PAS 2080. It might be familiar to you. So PAS 2080 is the global carbon management standard for the development of new infrastructure. And what this shows is that there's the greatest opportunity to make the most impact on a project, shown by the red line, during the early stages, and our ability to influence carbon outcomes gradually erodes as the design develops. And paradoxically, our ability to assess carbon impact, which is shown by the black line, typically improves as more detailed understanding of the scheme evolves. So this creates a bit of a problem for us as transport planners and designers. How can we quantify carbon impact at that early stage when we've got greatest influence or greatest opportunity to influence, but data is often more limited? Now, there's lots of tools out there, but often they only consider one aspect of a scheme's overall impact, such as construction, and often only at later stages in the project lifecycle. So when we've been developing Carbon Zero, we've wanted to try and create a tool that can be used to compare different schemes and options with the ability to undertake repeat appraisals right from the early stages of a project. We also wanted a tool that facilitates the aggregation of projects into a wider portfolio assessment so that we can start to understand the contribution of infrastructure towards carbon budgets.
So essentially what we've badged as the Carbon Zero Appraisal Framework is in reality it's a compilation of tools, data sets and methodologies for the appraisal of whole life carbon. There is a long list of factors that influence the carbon impact of infrastructure, as referenced in the Katy guidance. But we've summarised it into these three categories you can see on the slide here. And I'll explain how we appraise these in a bit more detail on the next slide. But we do also cover resilience. It is the other half of the climate emergency and not something we'll focus on in our presentation today. But, we've drawn on the latest EIA guidance to look at appraising how schemes are, how they'll operate under changing climate conditions and how their own impacts might affect other receptors, really so that we can start building adaptation in from the very earliest stages of scheme development. And all of these appraisal tasks, the outputs are presented in our report template for project level appraisal summaries, giving a concise, clear and visual communication of impacts. But we can also collate and analyse these at a programme level using our digital platforms. And these appraisals then really are used to challenge design and decision making from the earliest stages to supporting decisions on the type of infrastructure to deliver and how to design it. But also these bottom-up scheme appraisals in conjunction with the top-down baseline and pathway analysis can also support an understanding of what the gap is to decarbonisation commitments and what interventions and policies might fill it. So our appraisal of carbon impacts, like I said, is structured around these three high-level categories that really form what the net impact of a transport scheme will comprise of. This slide is quite a simplification of these. There are numerous sub-impacts within these categories. But presenting at this level, we found quite effective for communicating impact, particularly to those who aren't familiar with carbon appraisal or carbon impact. But it also gives us a structure that we can use to maximise carbon outcomes and performance. And I've got some examples on the following slide. But under each of these categories within Carbon Zero, we do draw on quite a wide range of tools, data and methodologies. Many of those are existing and established methods, and some are new ones that we've developed ourselves. So on user emissions, for example, that includes things like demand forecasting for modal shift or transport models for traffic flow and induced demand impacts. Whereas for embodied, our methods are built upon the cost estimation process to allow us to much more efficiently quantify carbon impact from material estimates from very earliest stages and break those down to inform design. We've also added this category called additional impacts and opportunities. And this really captures the impacts that aren't typically inherent to the transport scheme, but nonetheless can influence its impact. Things like carbon sequestration and storage from tree loss or tree planting, or sustainable energy generation. And there are methods, varied methods to assess the carbon impact of these. But I think this one's worth adding, and we often reference the example of Sturton Park and Ride in Leeds, opened recently. That's an example of a scheme where these kind of additional measures actually had quite a significant contribution to the overall carbon benefits of the scheme, particularly significant tree planting and solar canopies. But all of these appraisal tasks are underpinned by a few key principles. Of course, wherever we can, we appraise quantitatively, but it's proportionate while appraising the full impact, we supplement this with qualitative appraisal. And all our appraisal draws on the expertise of our specialists and those who understand the schemes and their impacts best. So, the transport modelers, the designers, the planners, the environmentalists, and more. But it's really, in simple terms, the sum of these three categories that forms the net impact of the transport scheme. And transparently breaking down the impact into these three categories gives us a framework to make decisions that maximise carbon performance by maximising the benefits and minimising the impacts. So, for example, the best performing carbon scheme really will kind of realise really strong user emission benefits through, notably modal shift, while having really negligible embodied impacts. And they may also have some additional benefits from things like tree planting. And embedding this kind of thinking in decision making and design to enable a carbon culture that helps shape carbon outcomes. But to put this in more kind of tangible terms, I thought I'd present two kind of quite different examples. So firstly, we take the example of a major new road scheme. So it could be a new bypass, a significant new highway that's typically proposed on a predict and provide basis. So, generally to provide capacity for predicted traffic growth or current congestion. And on user emissions, this might have actually some carbon savings potentially, from traffic efficiencies. It might reduce journey lengths and reduce congestion and associated stop-start traffic. But improvements for private car users will almost certainly have an induced demand that increases overall car use. And embodied emissions for a scheme like this can really be quite significant, as well as the ongoing maintenance for things like resurfacing every 20 years or so. And a scheme like this may also have some tree loss, and probably would though mitigate this through tree planting, and it might balance between those two impacts, but really in the context of a scheme like this is probably unlikely to be too significant on the overall impact. So at a simple level, as you can see on the kind of bar graph at the top, you'd probably expect a scheme like this over its appraisal period to have an adverse impact, so increased carbon emissions. But looking at the profile of those emissions over a scheme like appraisal period is equally important. You can see on this graph of cumulative emissions, the embodied impact all occurs at the beginning of a project, when really actually it's most urgent that we are limiting our emissions if we're to stay within carbon budgets. And even if this scheme, which, in the case of this example, it doesn't, even if it did have really strong user benefits, it would take years before that kind of embodied hit at the beginning of the project was paid back and it delivered a net benefit. So, in terms of what the implications and the advice at the back of this is, you'd hope this kind of appraisal would steer early stage decision making about the compatibility of this type of infrastructure with carbon budgets and other decarbonisation commitments. But it should also raise questions such as the timing of delivery, if it's to go ahead, can it be delayed until embodied and induced demand impact can be mitigated fully? But, if politicians do decide that a scheme like this should proceed, we have a duty to understand its impact from the earliest stages and take action to minimise. That means building in costs early for low carbon construction methods, maximising tree planting, or building in maximum levels of provision for active and shared modes, aside the kind of highway benefits. So an opposing scenario, take a cycle lane, for example. This could be expected to support a modal shift from car to cycling that reduces road user emissions. But embodied carbon, particularly a segregated cycle lane where you've got plenty of new surfacing, concrete for new curbs, that can erode some of those user benefits. A scheme like this may also have opportunities for a bit of kind of tree planting on site. But overall, you would expect a scheme like this, and this, certainly in this example, to give a carbon benefit over an appraisal period. But it does still have a payback period. In this case, it's about 10 years. The user emission benefits to outweigh the carbon debt from construction. So, this should raise questions about, is it an over-engineered solution, and is a different design philosophy needed? Can the payback period be reduced by choosing a solution that requires less materials? And that might mean road space reallocation instead of widening the highway. But you also need to factor in things like the limitations of a scheme level appraisal such as this. In isolation, schemes like this may only come out with very minor carbon benefits or even adverse, where there is a significant level of embodied, but relatively minor uplifts in active travel. But in reality, you have to consider that potentially there are much greater in combination benefits, particularly where a scheme like this might be delivered alongside other benefits as part of a coordinated strategy. And also, we're delivered in kind of coordination with parallel policy measures that might maximise behaviour change. But what we've got with Carbon Zero really is an ability to kind of understand these issues and have these conversations from the earliest stages, when, as Simon said, there's the greatest ability to influence. Sorry, that one's me as well. These insights from appraisals kind of then need to be obviously communicated in a clear, concise way, if they're to influence decision makers. And our carbon zero appraisal framework summaries have been designed to do this. So we try to present the results in a really consistent, clear and single page template. And on that, we've got some narrative, the data visualizations and metrics to support understanding of what a certain level of tons of CO2 impact means. And we also reference some of the uncertainties and influences likely future trends on this impact. But we can then also bring these appraisals into a web portal so that our clients can view them in one place, understand the aggregated impact, and how different combinations of schemes perform and compare.
So once individual scheme appraisals have been quantified, we can use these to compare the scale of impact at, say, a programme or a portfolio level. Now, in doing so, it's important to recognise the part that even small schemes can play in meeting our net zero targets. So whilst these may predict a more modest saving in absolute terms, shown here by the blue bars on the graph, they may in aggregate represent a better value for our investment if the costs involved are seen to be more proportionate. So it's for this reason that we've developed what we've called a carbon cost ratio metric that enables us to compare schemes of different scale. So using this metric, we can standardise schemes of different size and gauge their scale of carbon impact per £1 million of capital investment. So in the example shown here, we can see how smaller scale extensions of existing park and ride sites towards the right-hand side of the graph offered a greater carbon impact per £1 million of investment than development of a new standalone site, where the greater impact of construction tempered the relative carbon performance. And whilst infrastructure represents a key part of the jigsaw, our appraisals have started to demonstrate the limitations of what infrastructure alone can deliver, signposting the parallel policy interventions that will need to be laid in on top. By understanding the relative importance or the performance of a scheme against the impact categories that Tom set out, we can set expectations for how different types of scheme might be optimized for carbon performance. So for example, schemes with only modest levels of user emission reductions or that risk increases in user emissions must increase the appeal of shared and active modes, limit benefits to private vehicles or prevent rerouting. Schemes with high levels of embodied emissions may need to revisit what is built, avoiding overly engineered solutions if more ambitious approaches to road space reallocation, for example, can achieve the same outcomes. And schemes that struggle in both of those impact categories may have higher expectations for things like tree planting or sustainable energy generation to try and offset or boost relative performance.
So just to give you a flavour of kind of how we applied our carbon zero appraisal framework in practice, this is just a kind of selection of some of the projects we're working on. It has enabled us to review transport authorities' activities to determine whether they're consistent with the climate emergency, which is something we're doing with Somerset County Council at the moment. This can inform how current activities influence their emissions and how it fits in the context of carbon targets and budgets. This is of course particularly important for those with earlier carbon neutral net zero targets, who really need to be accelerating their action that goes above and beyond DfT policy, which really has its sights set on 2050. We're also supporting authorities in appraising the carbon impact of portfolios of schemes put forward for funding bids. This fulfills DfT's growing demand for understanding carbon reduction within their allocation of funding, but it also helps identify risks and signpost actions early so that we can maximise carbon outputs from those programmes. But then moving into the delivery of programs such as that, we've embedded carbon zero in scheme development to shape design and support business cases. On the Leeds Transforming Cities Fund at the moment, we're doing this across a really large programme, appraising whole life carbon impact, making design decisions and supporting programme level review of how different schemes perform.
So it's all well and good understanding the impact of our decisions, but ultimately it comes back to a culture of carbon and the willingness to make those decisions, even when the evidence points us to unpopular outcomes. So this graph shows how far off we are from our pathway to net zero, be that 2050 in line with government or earlier in line with many local authority aspirations. Our assessment of major infrastructure programmes geared to shared and active modes, some worth several £100 million, has shown them capable of shaving only negligible amounts off an authority's transport emissions. Absolutely, we need to ensure we're delivering the right infrastructure in the right way, but infrastructure can only get us so far. Infrastructure can provide more sustainable travel choices, undoubtedly, but ultimately it needs to provide politicians with the confidence to make tough decisions that change the way we all behave. And that's true not just within the transport sector, but all across the built environment as a whole. We can't continue to think of things in silos because there are many co-benefits to be realised of a more joined-up approach, particularly with things like the public health agenda and social inequality. Ultimately, it needs brave decision makers to help take this leap of faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we've got time for a couple of questions. There's one in the chat from Greg Marsden. Eric Thomas, and I'd like to take yours into the wider panel discussion, if that's okay. I think that's relevant for a lot of the speakers. So the question from Greg, who's unfortunately had to go and chair another session for Tom and Simon. I have seen schemes go through decision-making processes where full emissions are being ignored, particularly embodied emissions. Would WSP decide not to work for authorities that did not take a whole life cost approach?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of learning in the industry at the moment, and different clients, local authorities are in different positions on this at the moment. I think there's a rapid realization that they are needing to take a whole life cost approach. But I think actually getting there is taking time as authorities understand, you know, the implications on them for that. I think even in just, you know, since the publication of the Department for Transport's Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we've seen how quickly this has rocketed up the political agenda. And we see that continuing with the likes of, you know, the COP26 climate change conference just around the corner. And I think ultimately organisations such as ours are going to be obligated to make clients aware of the full implications of their decisions and move us away from, you know, traditionally we've been fixated arguably by a desire to stimulate economic growth at all costs. And very much I see carbon rising to the fore to sit alongside that. And, you know, yeah, we have a duty as an organisation advising clients such as that to make them aware of their responsibilities.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.